Hello, I'm Jeff DeGraff, and in these videos we're going to talk about the structure of the self. Not just any self, our creative self, our personal creative self, how we create in groups, and how we create in a much larger way, our transcendental self, the self that's bigger than our character. We're going to talk about how all of our selves come together to grow and our attempt to become whole. Normally, when we think about the self, we just think about our physical being or our character or our personality. But of course, there are multiple selves. If you've ever belonged to multiple groups, when you're in one group, you act one way. When you go to another group, you act another way. With your family, you act another way. That's our communal self. That's our social self. But there's also even another self. There's the self that has to operate in a world that makes demands of us. There's a self that has physical demands about driving to and from work. There's a financial self that has to do with, is the market good or not good? There's a self about being safe. There's a self about what makes the food we eat healthy. There are these larger forces as well that shape the self. So there's what we do, what the community around us does, and what the world imposes on us. So a good metaphor is to think about the self like Russian nesting dolls. You have the small doll with the bigger doll around it, with the bigger doll around it. It could go all the way up as far as you want the dolls to go. But the real question is, how do all of these dolls connect? And more importantly, how do they integrate to make the true self? Well, that's what we're going to discuss. Now, anytime we're looking to integrate ideas, we're going to have a way of mapping them. And our map today is called the Innovation Genome. And it basically looks at the self from 4 different angles. So think about, we're looking at one thing, but through 4 different panes of glass, if you will. Now, the Innovation Genome was really developed over a period of time by a number of researchers, 2 very important ones, Robert Quinn and Kim Cameron, who developed a model called the Competing Values Framework. This model is based on that model, but it takes a few more liberties in looking at creativity, and it integrates this in a more personal way to what we do individually, to what we do in communities, and the outcomes that we're likely to create. Now, these 4 perspectives are the create perspective, which is about doing things that are radically new, trying to be very creative in a very experimental way. The control perspective, which is about sort of establishing our safety zone, making sure that we're doing things that keep us nice and secure, the opposite of the create view. There's the compete view, which is very competitive, about doing things now, about achieving our goals and overcoming our barriers. And the opposite of that is the collaborate point of view, which is about doing things together and doing things that are going to last, doing things in our community. Now, these forces work in harmony collectively. But individually, they work against other forces. So the create force works against the control force and vice versa. The compete force works against the collaborate force, vice versa. This type of competition is not negative or not necessarily negative. If it's destructive, it's negative. But if it's constructive, if these types of forces against each other create new ways of doing things, hybrid ways of doing things, it's the absolute essence of being creative and integrating our creative self. Now, in order to understand how this works, you have to understand that there are some basic axes in which this works on. Part of our life is about looking externally. It's about our job, what happens in the workplace, what kind of things are emerging, what's in the news. And part of our life is looking internally. It's about what's going on with our family. It's about what's going on with my internal view of things. It's about what's going on in making sure that my personal life is in order. Part of this is about looking for flexibility. I want opportunities. I want things that are going to show up at a moment's notice that I can take advantage of. And I also want stability, which is the opposite. I want things that are predictable. I want things that happen in an ordinary fashion. Now, at any given time and in any given place, we might gravitate towards one of these directions. So think of it like north, south, east, and west. We're going to gravitate in one direction. And the direction that we go will largely determine what kind of self is going to be successful in that direction. Now, when we look at these 4 forces that create the self, we'll notice that there are 4 directions. That is, a north, a south, an east, and a west for the self. There might be a part of ourself that's facing outside, something that's going on outside of us, something at work, something in the news. But there's also a part that's going on inside of us, something that's going on in the personal relationship we have, maybe some thoughts that we're having that we're not sharing with people. There's also a part of being flexible. Sometimes we want to be open to new things. We want to take advantage of things as they emerge ad hoc. And sometimes we want things to be very stable. We want things to be predictable so that we don't feel so vulnerable to the world. These directions tell us what kind of self is going to be optimal in the situation that we might encounter. A way to think about these four forces is to think about a concept called dominant logic. And rather than explaining dominant logic to you, have you ever had somebody talk to you about religion or politics, right? Whenever they talk to you, they've never changed your mind and you've never changed their mind. Our dominant logic is basically how we organize the world, what we see as good and what we see as bad. So if we're going to integrate the self, what we're going to have to become aware of is our dominant logic and where our blind spots are, because our blind spots need to be integrated with our dominant logic so we can have a more complete view of ourselves and an opportunity to grow. Given that there are four forces for creativity, one of the things we have to do to grow our creative self is to figure out how to integrate them. Now, when we look at integrating these four forces, what we have to do is look at two sets of oppositional forces. Now, when these oppositional forces are destructive, it absolutely is a barrier to integrating our creative self. But when these oppositional forces are constructive, they create positive tension and create hybrids or new ways of doing things. And that's how we grow. So the first force is the create force, which is all about doing radical things, but with high risk. The opposing force is the control force, which is doing small things, but with low risk. The key here is to get these forces to work together in a positive way, to integrate them in a positive way so that the magnitude of our creativity goes up. This is the question of how much creativity we want to take on. The second set of forces are the force between the compete form of creativity and the collaborate form of creativity. Now, the compete form of creativity is all about now, now, now. It's very aggressive. It's about taking advantage to what's around us at any given moment. The collaborate form is much more dynamic in a natural way. It takes longer to develop a skill. It takes longer to develop a relationship. So it's not about now. The compete form of creativity is not very sustainable. It's very mercurial. It chases whatever is moving. The collaborate form of creativity is very sustainable, but it may miss the interesting opportunity. These two things together, when they're positive, determine how fast we can move on our creativity. It determines our ability to get momentum. It determines our speed. In order to integrate our creative self, we have to integrate these two sets of oppositions. Now that we understand how the four forces work together to create the creative structure of the self, let's look at how the three levels go together. At the top level is the universal self. That's the largest nesting doll. That's how things are. That's reality. Is there a war on? Is there a hurricane? Is there a market correction? These are things that we have very little control over, but will largely structure the self. We'll have to organize ourselves in order to survive and grow in that situation. The next nesting doll down is the communal self, how we are. I want you to think about how you change when you're with your group at church, or when you're with the sports team that you play pickup with, or when you're at work, or when you're with your family. It largely determines what kind of a self you are. You're negotiating that with the group. And finally, there's the smallest nesting doll. There's the individual self. That's how I am. This is the self that wakes up in the morning and goes to bed at night and has all kinds of thoughts about who you are. But you have to remember, over time, you are a different individual self. You're a different person than you were 5 years ago, and predictably, you're going to be a different person 5 years from now. Now, the key to growing the creative self is integrating these three levels. How do I take my personal or individual idea of the self And how does that grow within the context and the confines of the communal self? And how does that grow within the context and confines of the universal self? If these things don't integrate, we always feel at odds, and it's very difficult to grow the self. But when these things can be integrated, when they can be negotiated, when hybrids can be produced, it's the optimal environment for growing the structure of the creative self.